The eggs were sitting on Dale Offit's counter when he said it. He was the kind of man who crossed his arms before he finished listening, and he'd crossed them before I'd even set the carton down. 62 years old, fourth-generation poultry operation out on Route 9, Mercer County, West Virginia, and he looked at those eggs the way you might look at a child who'd wandered into a meeting she hadn't been invited to. "These came off your place?" and he said, "Yes, sir." He picked one up, turned it over. It was a deep cream color, almost tan, and it was large in a way that wasn't subtle, larger than the jumbo carton sitting open beside it on his counter, larger in a way that made the comparison uncomfortable for him, I could tell. He set it back down. "What are you feeding those birds?" I told him. "Layer pellets from southern states. A crushed oyster shell mixed into the scratch twice a week. Clean water changed twice daily. About 40 minutes of ranging on the south pasture each afternoon when the weather held." He uncrossed his arms just long enough to pick up the egg again, then crossed them back. "Oyster shell," he said, the way someone repeats something back to you when they think you've mispronounced it. "Yes, sir. That's a waterfowl supplement." "It's calcium," I said. "Ducks need calcium for shell integrity, same as chickens do. More, actually, because they lay larger eggs to begin with, and the drain on. I know what calcium does." He set the egg down harder than he needed to. "How old are you?" I told him I was 19. He nodded like that explained everything. That was March 4th, 2022. A Friday. Cold enough that the puddles in his gravel driveway hadn't thawed by noon. I drove home 18 miles on Route 9, and then 4 more on Copley Road, which the county stopped maintaining sometime in the previous decade, and which my grandfather had called the Long Apology, because of the way it wound back and forth through the hollow, like it was sorry for taking you somewhere nobody else wanted to go. The farm sat at the end of it. 14 acres, a farmhouse built in 1941, a hay barn that leaned 11 degrees to the east, a smokehouse nobody had smoked anything in since 1987, and a duck operation that had begun 8 months earlier as 42 khaki Campbell hens, in a pen I'd repaired with wire I found rolled up behind the old tractor shed. I hadn't planned to be here. I hadn't planned any of it. My grandmother had died the previous June, and the farm had come to me because there was nobody else. And for the first 3 months, I had simply tried not to let anything else fall down or die. That was where I started. That was the whole of it in the beginning. The first thing I understood about ducks was that they didn't care whether I knew what I was doing. The khaki Campbells went about their business with a kind of brisk indifference that I found in those early weeks almost comforting. They woke before I did. They had opinions about the arrangement of their water troughs. They laid when they were ready and not before, and they did not require my approval or my schedule. I appreciated that. I was 20 years old, and I had inherited 14 acres and a leaning barn and a silence so complete that on some mornings the only sound before 6 a.m. was the creek that ran along the south fence line, and the particular complaint the farmhouse stairs made on the 4th step up. My grandmother had run the duck operation for 11 years before she died. Before that, it had been laying hens, 60-some Rhode Island Reds, and before that, the farm had been a dairy, though the dairy equipment had been sold at auction in 1994, the year my grandmother turned 62 and decided she was not going to get up at 4 in the morning anymore for anything that had hooves. The switch to ducks had been her own idea, and she had researched it with the same methodical attention she applied to everything. I know this because she kept a notebook. She kept several, actually. I found the first one in November, wedged behind the feed records in the rollaway desk in the corner of the kitchen. A green composition book, the kind you buy for school, with her handwriting on the cover in black marker. Duck Notes, Year 1. Inside, she had dated every entry. March 4th, March 11th, April 2nd. Each page had columns, feed amounts, water temperature, egg counts, weather, notes. The notes were where she put everything else: observations, questions, experiments, small failures she recorded without drama. On June 19th of her first year, she had written, "Girls seem off, shells thin enough to flex at the tip, check calcium." And then, 2 pages later, on July 3rd, tried crushed oyster shell mixed into feed at 1 tablespoon per bird per day. Will watch. And then, July 14th. Better. Noticeably better. Shell weight up. Some eggs running large. I sat at the kitchen table with that notebook for almost 2 hours the night I found it. The wood stove had burned down to coals. The clock above the sink read 9:40. Outside, the temperature had dropped back below freezing, and the yard light cast a yellow oval on the snow. I had been losing shell quality since October. I hadn't known what to do about it. I'd asked at the feed store in Harwick and gotten a shrug, and a recommendation for a calcium supplement that cost $40 for a bag that would last 3 weeks. I had written it down in my own notebook, the one I'd started keeping in September, because I'd realized slowly that this place required a record. The bag was still sitting on the passenger seat of the truck, actually. I hadn't bought it yet. I'd stood in the feed store aisle for 10 minutes holding it, doing the math in my head. $40 times roughly 16 weeks of winter remaining equaled $640 for something that might not even work, for a product I didn't understand well enough to trust. I had put it back on the shelf. I had driven home with the truck smelling like diesel and with nothing solved. And here, in a notebook that had been sitting in a kitchen drawer for what looked like 30 years, based on the yellowing of the pages and the fading of the ink, was the answer. Not a guess, not a shrug. A recorded experiment with dates and observations, and a conclusion drawn from watching the same birds in the same climate on the same land I was standing on right now. I turned back to July 3rd and read the entry again more carefully. Tried crushed oyster shell mixed into feed at 1 tablespoon per bird per day. Will watch. No brand mentioned, no store, no cost, just a quantity and a method. I sat with that for a minute. Crushed oyster shell was something I knew existed. I'd seen it on the shelf, 2 rows over from the calcium supplement, in a plain paper bag, the kind that looked like it hadn't been redesigned since the 1970s. I had walked past it without a second thought, because nothing about it had been marketed to me. It just sat there, unlabeled almost, behind the branded things with photographs of healthy hens on the front. I got up from the table and went to find my own notebook. It was on the counter near the coffee maker, under a piece of mail I hadn't opened. I opened to the most recent page, November entries, mostly inventory and repair notes, and I wrote, "Crushed oyster shell, 1 tablespoon per bird per day. Check price at Harwick Co-op versus the bag at Tillman's." Then I sat back down with her notebook and kept reading. She had continued to track the shell quality through August and into September of that first year, and the improvement held. By late August, she had written, "Consistent, eggs running larger than before across most of the flock. No change in feed quantity otherwise. Cost negligible." The word negligible was underlined once, lightly, in the same hand as the rest. It wasn't emphatic, it was just noted, the way someone notes something they want to remember to tell somebody later. She had known something for 30 years that I had been within arm's reach of in that feed store aisle and hadn't recognized. But the knowledge had been sitting in this drawer the whole time I'd been struggling through October and November, watching shells get thinner and doing nothing useful about it. I didn't feel foolish. I felt something more complicated than that. I sat with the notebook for another hour, past the point when the kitchen went cold, and I had to put on my grandfather's wool sweater, the green one with the frayed right cuff, just to stay comfortable at the table. The lamp on the counter was the only light on. Outside, the yard was completely dark, except for the motion sensor light over the barn door, which had clicked on and off twice from something moving in the brush at the tree line. Probably the raccoon I'd been ignoring for 2 weeks. She had kept the notebook in a particular way. Not a diary. She didn't write about feelings. Not directly. She wrote in columns sometimes, and in short, dense paragraphs other times, and occasionally in what I can only describe as lists of suspicions. Things she thought might be true, hadn't confirmed yet, and was watching. The oyster shell entry had been in that last category when it started. By the end of August, it had moved into the settled fact column, 4 lines, dated, with a note about cost per pound at the co-op in 1987, and a small calculation of how much she'd spend over a full year for a flock of 22 birds. 22 birds. I had 16. The math was easier for me, technically, but I didn't know yet what oyster shell cost at Harwick in the current year. I'd only glanced at the bag without turning it over. That was a detail I'd need tomorrow. I turned to the front of her notebook to find the date it started. October 1983. She would have been, I did the arithmetic in my head twice to be sure, 31 years old. Younger than I'd always imagined her in this kitchen. I had only known her as an old woman, her hair white, her hands already marked by decades of work. The person writing in October 1983 was a young woman trying to figure out her own flock in her own first years of running the place properly. I hadn't known that. I don't know why I assumed she had always known what she knew. I don't know why we assume that about the people who raise us. I closed the notebook carefully and set it on top of my own, the two of them together on the table. Hers was soft from handling, the cover corners rounded down to almost nothing. Mine was stiff, 8 weeks old, the spine barely creased. I went to bed thinking about the co-op, whether they'd have crushed shell in stock or whether I'd need to ask them to order it, and whether the drive was worth it compared to whatever Tillman's charged. Practical thoughts, the kind that let you sleep. What I didn't think about, not yet, was the rest of the notebook. I hadn't finished it. I was maybe 2/3 through. There were more entries after September 1987, and I hadn't read them. The next morning was a Tuesday, October 14th, 2021. I know because I wrote it at the top of my own page when I sat down with my coffee before the light was fully up. And I looked at that date for a moment before I wrote anything else. My grandmother had made her entry about oyster shell on a Tuesday in October, too, though 38 years apart. I don't think that means anything, but I noticed it. I drove to the co-op in Harwick, 16 miles on Route 9, the last 4 on the county road that runs alongside the Menace Creek drainage. I got there when they opened at 7:30. The man behind the counter was the same one who had been there every time I'd come in since June, heavy-set, reading glasses pushed up into his hair, a Purina calendar on the wall behind him open to October. He knew my grandfather's name. He called me young lady the first 3 times I came in, then stopped after I corrected him once, quietly, and now he just nodded when I walked through the door. I asked about crushed oyster shell. He said they kept a 50-pound bag on the shelf in the back and could order it by the pallet if I needed volume. I bought one bag to start, $12.40, and asked what other customers were doing for laying flocks. He said most people in the county were keeping chickens, not ducks, and for ducks, he honestly wasn't sure what the difference was in supplemental calcium needs. He said it the way people say things when they're being honest rather than helpful, which I respected. I told him what I'd read. He wrote something down on a notepad near the register. On the drive back, I thought about what my grandmother had written in that entry, the phrase she used, that the shells came back into her system within 48 hours. She'd timed it. She'd waited and watched and recorded the result. She hadn't just tried something and moved on. That was the part that stayed with me. I got home, unloaded the bag, and put a shallow dish of the crushed shell inside the duck shelter alongside the feed. I wrote it down, time, amount, the brand printed on the bag, the position of the dish. I wrote that I was uncertain whether they would eat it voluntarily or whether it needed to be mixed into feed. Then I underlined observe and gave myself a margin note with a small bracket and the word 48 hours inside it. I was copying her method without quite meaning to. I wasn't thinking about that yet. I was thinking about the ducks, which were standing 3 feet away from the dish, looking at me, not at the shell. That night, I picked the notebook back up. The entry I found that night was dated March 1961. Not spring, still cold, she wrote. Frost on the inside of the barn window in the mornings. She had 12 ducks at that point, a mixed flock. And she was trying to push production through the cold months because they needed the income. Her husband had taken on a second job driving grain trucks on weekends, and she didn't want that to continue longer than it had to. That was how she framed it, not as ambition, but as a specific problem she was trying to solve. She wrote that in cold weather, the shells of her eggs had gone thin. Not every egg, but enough to matter. She'd cracked 3 just picking them up out of the nest that week. She described the waste in a single flat sentence, the way someone writes about something that genuinely costs them sleep. Then she wrote that she had started reading about the relationship between cold, calcium metabolism, and shell formation. And she'd gotten a pamphlet from the county extension office in Genesee and cross-referenced it with something a neighbor, a woman she called only by a last name, had mentioned at the church potluck in February. What struck me was how she moved between sources, a pamphlet, a conversation, her own observation of the flock. She didn't treat any one of them as more authoritative than the others. She wrote, "The pamphlet gave the principle, and she gave the example, and the ducks themselves gave the answer." I read that line twice. She had started with a small amount of crushed oyster shell. She didn't give the exact weight in that entry, but she noted she kept it separate from the feed, offered free choice in a clay dish she described as being about the size of a soup bowl. She watched to see who went to it first. She named which duck went first. She recorded the time of day. After 48 hours, she noted the shells of the eggs improved noticeably. After 5 days, she wrote, "I believe we have this settled." I set the notebook on my knee and looked across the room. Outside the window, the yard light was on over the duck shelter, and I could see the faint shape of the flock bunched together near the east wall. They do that in cold weather, press themselves into the corner that holds heat, longest from the afternoon sun. I thought about my own shallow dish sitting inside that shelter, and whether any of them had touched it yet, and I found I didn't want to go check. Not because I was afraid of failure, but because I wanted the 48 hours to be honest, no interference, no anxious adjustments. That was part of her method too, I think. Even where she hadn't written it down explicitly, the discipline of leaving things alone long enough to learn something true. I kept reading. The next pages were dated February of 1959. The handwriting had changed slightly, still hers, but smaller, more compressed, as if she had decided to take up less space on the page. Or perhaps as if she had simply grown more efficient with ink over the winter. She was writing about the cold that year. She noted the temperature on February 11th as 9 degrees Fahrenheit before sunrise, and she wrote that the water pan in the duck yard had frozen through entirely, despite the hay she had packed around it. She had hauled warm water from the kitchen in a covered pot 3 times that day. What she did not write was any complaint. She described it the way a mechanic describes a problem. Here is the variable, here is the adjustment, here is the result. The ducks drank when the water was warm. The ducks did not stand around waiting. She noted which ones drank immediately and which ones waited for the others to go first. She had names for all of them. I recognized that habit. My grandfather had named every animal on this property, including ones that no one else considered worth naming. The barn cats, the individual hens, a particular ewe that arrived one spring and never quite fit with the others. I had kept that up. It was one of the first things I'd done when I moved back in October. I'd gone to the shelter in the early morning with my notebook and sat with them until I could tell them apart, reliably, and then written down what I observed until the names suggested themselves. You don't force names onto animals. You watch long enough and they show you what they are. She had a duck she called the General, the one who always went to the dish first. She mentioned the General 14 times across these pages, always watching, always noting whether the General's behavior had shifted. In March, she wrote that the General's eggs were the first to show a consistent improvement in shell density. She tested this by holding them up to a candle flame, the old method, to check the translucency and the wall thickness at the air cell. She wrote the word remarkable once, underlined it, then wrote nothing else on that page. I sat with that for a moment. It takes a lot to make someone underline a word and then stop writing. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it working at the corner of the house where the siding had started to separate from the frame, a project I had written down for March, assuming the ground was workable by then. The furnace cycled on and the pipes ticked. I turned the page and she was back to her data, recording weights of eggs in ounces, sorting them by date, tracking the shells with a small notation system she had invented herself. A circle meant acceptable. A circle with a cross meant strong. A circle with a dot at the center meant something she called first grade. I had never heard that term applied to eggs before. By the end of January, she had graded nearly 400 eggs using that system. The circles with dots appeared for the first time in the 3rd week after she introduced the shells, and by the 5th week, they outnumbered the plain circles by a ratio she noted as 2-to-1. She didn't celebrate this in the writing. She just recorded it, dated it, and moved on to the next column. That restraint told me something about her. A person who writes remarkable and then stops, who refuses to let excitement blur the data, is a person who has been wrong before and learned what that costs. I found the loose page between entries dated February 9th and February 11th, 1961. It wasn't numbered, which is why I almost missed it. It had been folded in thirds, like a letter, and tucked flat against the binding, where the glue had started to pull away from the spine. I unfolded it carefully, holding the edges. It was a list of names, and 12 names written in a different ink, darker, more deliberate, and beside each name, a number and what looked like a price. Some numbers were in dozens, some were in half dozens. 3 of the names I recognized from the county. 2 of them were family names that still appeared on mailboxes out on Route 9, the road I'd driven every week since October to get to the feed co-op. She had been selling eggs, not to a processor, not through the co-op, directly to 12 households by name, at prices she'd negotiated herself. The prices were higher than anything the co-op would have paid, considerably higher. I set the page down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. The furnace was running. Outside, the wind had eased, but the cold had settled into that particular still quality that means it's gotten colder, not better. I thought about what it would have taken in 1961 to go to 12 different households and convince them that your eggs were worth more than store eggs. I thought about how young she would have been. I'd done the math once and written it in pencil on the inside cover of the notebook, then erased it, then done it again. She would have been 22. The egg she'd been selling, the first-grade egg, was larger. Shell density she'd measured and documented. Yolk that stood higher in the pan. All of it traceable back to the crushed shell program she'd started with a handwritten note to a feed supplier, whose name I couldn't fully make out. The supplier's response had been paperclipped to the inside front cover of the notebook, which I hadn't noticed until that moment when I went back to look. I unpinned the clip carefully. The paper was thin, almost translucent at the fold lines. The letter was typed on a manual typewriter, some of the letters slightly uneven, the E's and A's sitting a fraction higher than the rest. The date at the top, March 14th, 1961. The company name was printed on the letterhead, Harmon and Briggs Agricultural Supply, Bellwether, Ohio, and below that, a line I had to hold to the light to read, serving the Tri-County farming community since 1923. The response was brief, 7 lines. The supplier confirmed receipt of her inquiry regarding crushed oyster shell supplementation for laying flocks and noted that they could supply the product in 50-pound bags at a rate of 85 cents per bag. He noted, and this is the part I read twice, that the inquiry was unusual in its specificity, and that he had not previously received a written request from a producer who had enclosed supporting documentation. He used that phrase exactly, supporting documentation, meaning she had sent them something, meaning she had written to a commercial supplier as a 22-year-old woman running a small flock in a rural county and attached evidence. I set the letter down flat on the table beside the notebook. I'd seen the notebook's first pages, the grid she'd drawn by hand, the measurements, but I hadn't understood until this moment that she had sent a copy of that grid, or something like it, to a feed supplier as justification for an unusual order. She hadn't asked tentatively. She had documented her case and enclosed it. The furnace kicked off and the house went quiet. I thought about the word unusual. The supplier hadn't said impressive. He hadn't said thorough. He'd said unusual, which meant it had been outside his expectation, which meant his expectation had been low, and she had exceeded it far enough that he'd felt the need to note it in a business letter. A small acknowledgement from a man who probably wrote 30 letters a week and kept a carbon copy of each one in a filing cabinet she would never see. She had gotten her oyster shell. The notebook showed the first delivery in April of that year, noted in the margin in red ink. First bag, 50 pounds, 85 cents, started at 2% ration by weight. I stood up and refilled my coffee. It had gone cold while I was reading. Outside, the motion sensor light above the coop was off, which meant the birds had settled for the night. No disturbance, Just 23 ducks in the dark, their crops full, their bodies already working through calcium, producing shell, doing the slow metabolic work they do every night without any help from me. I sat back down. I still had the last third of the notebook to read, and I had the sense, the specific, careful sense, that whatever she'd found out in that final third was the reason the notebook had been kept at all. The final third of the notebook changed in character. The handwriting was the same, her careful, slightly backward slanted cursive, but the entries grew longer, less like a log, and more like letters she hadn't sent to anyone. The dates were less regular. Sometimes a week would pass between entries, sometimes 3. The first long entry in that section was dated October 14th. She had been keeping the ducks for 2 full laying seasons by then. She wrote that she had started selling the surplus eggs to the diner on Route 9, not the co-op, but directly a private arrangement with the woman who ran the kitchen there. 36 cents a dozen, cash, every Tuesday morning. She wrote the number out carefully, 36 cents per dozen, not 30, because she looked at them and said, "These are not ordinary eggs." And I agreed with her, because they are not. I stopped at that line for a moment. She had known. She had watched the yolks deepen, watched the shells resist the knuckle test she'd written about earlier. A firm tap, no give, and she had already understood what the calcium was doing before anyone confirmed it for her. She hadn't needed the confirmation. She just needed the supply. The next entries tracked the diner arrangement through the winter. 42 dozen in November, 38 in December, when laying slows with the light, back to 46 in February after she rigged a single bare bulb on a timer inside the coop. 14 hours of light, she wrote, is what they need to think it's still summer, and they are not difficult to convince. Then in March, a different kind of entry, short, just 3 lines. The man from the feed store asked me today where I was getting such consistent shells. He said a woman up the county had been losing shells all winter, soft and cracked, and he couldn't figure why. I told him I'd read about oyster shell in a poultry circular from the extension office. He said he'd never heard of that working so well. I told him it had been working for me for 2 years. She hadn't mentioned the notebook, hadn't mentioned the cooperative's letter, or the months of back-and-forth correspondence, or the trial period logged in red ink. She had just said she'd read about it. I understood that. There was a kind of private satisfaction in knowing the full depth of a thing, while only showing the surface to someone who hadn't earned the rest of it. I turned the page. There were 12 more entries between that March and the following August, and partway through them, she started writing something I hadn't expected. Not about the ducks, not about the eggs, but about the land itself, and what she intended to do with it after. The entries about the land were different in tone from everything that came before. Less careful, less measured. Where her duck records had been precise, dated, numbered, annotated in the margins, these new pages had a looser quality, like she was writing before the thought had fully formed, trying to catch something that kept moving. The first one was dated the 2nd week of June, a Tuesday. I have been thinking about the East 40. The soil there drains badly, and my father always said it was useless for anything but pasture. But I walked it yesterday morning after the rain, and I think he was wrong. Or he was right for his time, and I am right for mine, which is not the same as him being wrong. I read that sentence twice. I had walked that same field. It still drained badly, but she had seen something in it. The next entry, 4 days later. The cooperative has a man who advises on soil amendment. I wrote to him about the East 40. He says if I am serious about it, I would need 3 years minimum before I saw any real change, and I should not expect a cash return inside of 5. He was trying to discourage me. I could tell because he included the information anyway. She had written the cooperative's advisor's advice in red ink, the same red she used for confirmed results. I turned 5 more pages. She had mapped the East 40 by hand, a rough sketch with compass directions marked, and drainage patterns noted in small diagonal hatch marks. It wasn't elegant, but it was thorough. You could see where the water moved, where it stalled, where the slope shifted by just enough degrees to matter. In the margin, she had written a single note. If this works, the ducks can move here in summer. Natural grasses. Less feed cost. She was connecting everything. The eggs, the shells, the soil, the ducks, the cost, the time. She was building something that wouldn't pay out until long after she had done the hardest part of the work. The last entry in that section was dated August 19th, a Saturday. The handwriting changed slightly, more pressed into the page, like she was writing at the kitchen table rather than somewhere in the field. The eggs are moving well at market now. 2 families asked specifically for mine this week. One of them said the yolks stand up differently. I did not explain why. I just said the birds are well cared for. That is true, and it is enough. I closed the notebook and held it for a moment, both hands flat against the cover. Outside, the afternoon had shifted. The light coming through the barn window had gone from white to pale gold, which meant it was closer to 5 than I'd realized. I had 12 birds to water, and the East 40 was waiting. I set the notebook on the shelf where I could see it from the doorway and went out to water the birds. The 12 ducks were in the East run, moving the way they move at that hour. Unhurried, low to the ground, heads tilting at things I couldn't see. I watched them for a moment before I turned on the hose. There is something about the late afternoon light on a duck's feathers that I can't fully explain. It's not beautiful in any postcard sense. It's just very specific, very real, the kind of thing you notice when you've been kneeling in a barn reading someone's handwriting for 3 hours. I filled the troughs, topped the feed dishes, checked the nesting boxes. 3 eggs still warm. I brought them inside and set them on the counter next to Tuesdays, which I'd already washed and carton packed for the Saturday market. That was September 14th, a Friday. By the following spring, April, May into June, I had a waiting list. 11 households in the county. 2 restaurants, one of them 40 minutes away in Harrisburg, which I hadn't expected. The eggs were moving at $4.50 a dozen, up from the $2.75 I'd started at when I first brought them to the Calhoun County Farmers Market the summer before. The yolks were dense and orange-yellow, the kind that hold their shape in the pan. People started asking what I was feeding the birds. I told them the birds were well cared for, that they had access to natural grasses and clean water and mineral supplementation from crushed shell. I didn't break it down further than that. My grandmother hadn't either. The farm is still not easy. I want to be clear about that. There are mornings in February when nothing wants to work, and I don't either. The tractor is 17 years old. The east fence needs work. I keep pushing to next month. The mortgage payment is real, and it comes every month regardless of what the weather does. But the foundation of what I'm doing here, the actual logic of it, I found in a notebook on a shelf in the back of a barn. My grandmother had worked it all out, the shells, the soil, the cost, the timing. She just didn't get far enough to see it through, so I'm seeing it through for her. If you've got a barn you haven't fully walked through, or a box of notebooks you haven't opened, or an old building you were always told wasn't worth looking in, I'd say look anyway. The thing you find might not be treasure in any way you'd recognize at first. It might just be someone's careful handwriting, someone who was working on something they didn't get to finish. That's worth a lot more than people assume. If this reached you, share it. Leave a comment about what you found or what you're still looking for.